Joining us now, Professor Doga Eralp is a lecturer in the School of International Service at American University. Lisel Hintz is a professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Her new book, Identity Politics Inside Out, comes out August 28th. Joining us from a studio in Washington, Aykan Erdemir is a former member of the Turkish Parliament and a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. And via Skype from the U.S. state of Ohio, Ragip Soylu is Washington Correspondent for the daily Sabah Turkish newspaper. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Doga, let me start with you. As we heard there from our correspondent, the ostensible reason for this latest crisis is the detention of the U.S. evangelical pastor Andrew Brunson. But is there more to it? Why have relations deteriorated so much?
Well, the relations have been deteriorating for almost more than 2 years now, and this particular incident where the pastor has been detained has already been going on for a few months. So what has occurred obviously added more salt to injury on the American side following this rather important trial in New York about the Iranian-Turkish business person Reza Zarrab, who had violated earlier, a few years back, the American sanctions on Iran by engaging in gold for cash trade. So the relations have already been tense around that particular incident, and the detention of Pastor Brunson obviously infuriated the Trump administration even more, and in their mind, it emphasized Turkish lack of cooperation as an ally, as they would have preferred to see early on.
We're talking about, well, individuals here. You know, the pastor in the case of Andrew Brunson, you talk about the Iranian-Turkish businessman here in New York. How did this escalate to the point where it's affecting relations between two major countries?
Well, two countries have already been facing different points of divergences over the course of more than a decade now, ever since the second invasion of Iraq by the U.S. forces in March 2003. The two countries' goals in the Middle East started diverging. And obviously, Erdogan administration relied in the first few years of their administration very heavily on U.S. backing. But as the country slowly tried to reposition itself, especially after the Arab Spring and in Syria, the relations have increasingly grown tense and tense and tenser.
Lisel, does this surprise you? These are two allies. They're NATO allies.
Mm-hmm. No, it's actually not too surprising to me. Although it is unprecedented. I would say that we've seen a number of tensions between Turkey and the U.S., even though they are NATO allies. Doga mentioned the 2003 Iraq War. There was the Cyprus crisis. There have been a number of different issues that Turkey and the U.S. have sort of disagreed over. And I would add to that, just in the past couple of years, Turkey's purchase or agreement to purchase the S-400 missile defense system from Russia. This is, I think, in addition to the Andrew Brunson case, I think one of the most contentious points between the U.S. and Turkey, partially because the S-400 missile defense system is not compatible with NATO technology, and there could be some risks of intelligence compromising given the F-35 jets that Turkey was purchasing. There's also the point that the U.S. was arming the Syrian Kurdish YPG forces in their fight against ISIS, and for Turkey now, they consider the YPG to be equivalent to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which they consider a terrorist group. So there are a number of different issues that I think are really at the heart of this. But what I want to point out first is that it's not just Andrew Brunson when we talk about individuals. There are other Turkish U.S. citizens, dual nationals who have been held, including a NASA scientist. And there are also foreign service nationals who work for the U.S. Consular Services who have been detained on trumped-up charges. This isn't surprising to me because I think when you're talking about not just two countries but two leaders who are both what I put in the category of hyper-masculine nationalist strongmen who are quite aggressive and not necessarily willing to back down. So no, this doesn't surprise me that much.
Let me go to Ragip Soylu. Ragip, the United States has also imposed tariffs on Turkish imports of steel and aluminium, 50% and 20% respectively. The White House says these tariffs are specific to U.S. national security. This is how Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan responded to the tariffs and the U.S. reason for imposing those tariffs. Let's watch.
Bir taraftan stratejik ortak olacaksın.
On the one hand, you are a strategic partner. On the other, you shoot yourself in the foot. On the one hand, you are a strategic partner with us in Afghanistan when everybody else was leaving. You are a strategic partner with us in Somalia. you are a strategic partner in NATO. And on the other hand, you stab your ally in the back. Is this acceptable?
What do you make of that, Ragip?
I mean, tariffs are illegal according to U.S. law because, the reasoning of this law was about the huge imports threatening U.S. national security by undercutting the stability inside the country in terms of the markets and in terms of the American producers. But these tariffs are used as a political tool against Ankara to provide and facilitate Brunson's release by imposing pressure on Turkish leaders. And if you look at Trump's statements today at White House, he was speaking about some sanctions against Turkey, and in the same sentence, he talks about tariffs as another part of sanctions that are imposed on Turkey related to Pastor Brunson. So first and foremost, they're legal, and secondly, it's not just legal in the eyes of American law, they're legal, maybe not legal, but out of rules, just by violating the World Trade Organization rules, obviously. And Turkey also went to the World Trade Organization, filed a petition, and there are other countries who also filed petitions to World Trade Organization against the United States of America, like the European Union, China. So we will see what will come out of this.
Aykan, what is your view on this? To what do you attribute this breakdown in relations?
There have been numerous issues ranging from security to foreign policy to Erdogan's hostage diplomacy, which has not only targeted U.S. nationals, permanent residents, and employees of the State Department, but also over 40 European nationals, ranging from human rights activists to journalists to other faith leaders. So clearly, Turkey's pivot away not only from the transatlantic alliance, but its values have taken a toll on Turkish-U.S. relations, as it has also taken a toll on Turkey-EU relations. And now that the crisis has escalated beyond control, it comes at a very opportune moment for Erdogan, because with the economic crisis, Erdogan can now point the finger to the U.S. and argue that this is all Washington's making. This is economic warfare on Turkey, which allows him to deflect blame and responsibility for years and years of economic mismanagement at home. Whereas most analysts have warned over the years that Turkey's economy was overheating, Turkey's turn to authoritarianism would have a toll on its economy, and Turkey's drift in foreign policy would also hit its markets, would also undermine global investor confidence. So we are now seeing the perfect storm as Turkey's domestic, foreign, and economic mismanagement come together in a great catastrophe for the country.
Doga, is this Turkey moving away from the transatlantic alliance?
Well, Turkey is not moving away from the transatlantic alliance. Turkey, in Ankara's mindset, in Erdogan's mindset, is trying to diversify its partners. But I think it's quite questionable the extent to which you could actually diversify your partners when you have a large chunk of your trade with the West, primarily with the European Union and European countries, and along with the United States. Now, Turkey is trying to diversify its outreach, not only in foreign policy, obviously in trade and investment with Russia and China. And the mistakes that Turkey did along the way is just a simple consequence of rushing too fast and too soon, especially the deals that Turkey made with Russia, with the nuclear plants and whatnot, provides a lot of unnecessary securities, government securities for Russian investment. And it's actually exactly this mindset that puts the Turkish economy in quite a fragile state for really these huge investments, such as the third international airport that's supposed to be built in Istanbul, supposed to be the largest airport in the world, and also this channel that they're supposed to be building. And these kind of mega projects does quite the opposite of what government intends to do. It actually creates further sense of insecurity in investors, and it's actually a sign of insincerity and lack of seriousness on the side of Ankara.
Lisel, as we heard from our correspondent in Istanbul, the Turkish currency, the lira, has taken a battering. It lost value. It recovered a bit on Thursday morning, but it lost value later in the afternoon. What's behind the lira's loss, and what kind of impact is that having on Turkey?
Right. So I think the first thing that's really important to understand here is that it's not just Andrew Brunson, and it's not just the sanctions and the position that the U.S. has taken. The Turkish economy has already been pointed out, has been heated up for a long time. In order to sustain his political position, Erdogan has tried to keep economic growth as high as he can, particularly ahead of the presidential election that took place in June of this year. And that involved a lot of short-term capital investments, that involved an immense amount of foreign borrowing, basically unsustainable policies. And I think we're seeing that come to the head now. And investors have noticed that. And so when you have this now culminated with the U.S., sort of calling out Turkey and saying, we're not willing to have you not, give up these individuals that you've taken in terms of hostage diplomacy, that's also sending a very strong message to investors who are concerned about risk. And so the lira was already, had already been losing a lot of value. I remember when I was in Turkey in 2013, I think it was 1.5 to the dollar, and it's certainly become much more precipitous. But it was already in free fall. Now, I think what's even more important to recognize about this is that the U.S. and the way that it is trying to coerce Turkey into complying with its wishes does have an effect on the lira. And so you saw, for example, last Friday with Erdogan, giving a very sort of "you will not bring Turkey to its knees" kind of a speech, followed by his son-in-law, the Minister of Finance and the Treasury, trying to reassure markets. But at the same time, that's exactly when Trump comes out with his tweet about doubling the tariffs. Mm-hmm. And that just, you're trying to reassure markets, and then all of a sudden you're hearing this kind of a message. And so I think investors were incredibly concerned about that. I think there's also been the risk of contagion. We have Spanish banks, for example, very exposed to Turkey. So I think there's a lot of concern there.
Ragip, if we look at the response from the United States insofar as the pastor Andrew Brunson is concerned, the U.S. is playing hardball here with Turkey. In the case of Andrew Brunson, Vice President Mike Pence said Turkey would do well not to test President Trump's resolve to see Americans who are wrongfully imprisoned in foreign lands returned home to the United States. That's a threat there. How does Turkey respond to something like that?
I mean, they just don't agree with the threat itself, and they like to ignore, and they won't accept any sort of threats economically or in other ways. And if you speak with the Turkish officials, they would just tell you that it won't work, and it has never worked in Turkish history, actually, because, this is not the first time there is a crisis between Turkey and the United States. I mean, there has been many crises, and if you look into them, you just see that none of the threats or embargoes or sanctions from the United States against Turkey didn't work, because even the Turkish opposition parties basically backing Turkish President Erdogan in this crisis, because you're just trying to bully a NATO ally and a nationalistic people who are very proud of their history and their country by imposing this sort of sanctions and tariffs and trying to pressure the Turkish president to intervene in Turkish judicial system to release Brunson. And that's one of the funny things about this issue, that if you speak with the State Department spokesman, Heather Nauert, she would never ever tell you that they're asking Turkish president to intervene and interfere in Turkish judicial process and release Brunson. She would just deflect the question because they don't want to say that. And all the time you're talking about the American citizens that are, arrested in Turkey. But why don't we speak about almost a dozen of Turkish citizens who are arrested in the United States? Some of them are almost kidnapped from different countries because they're allegedly violated the Iranian sanctions. And there's also Mehmet Hakan Atillah's former Halkbank executive, State Bank executive case. And Mehmet Hakan Atillah's case is very important and interesting, actually exceptional, because there has been in the past many different banks from different countries which were accused of violating Iranian sanctions. But in none of these cases you would have never seen a bank executive was actually arrested and stood a trial and got sentenced. They never tried to do that. So this is the first time they basically charged a Turkish bank executive, not just Turkish, but just a bank executive in Iranian sanctions. And then and he's basically a semi-state official. So this is one of the reasons of the crisis that Turkish officials believe all these Iranian sanctions, drama, and these charges are basically made up, because these are just related to U.S. laws, and these U.S. laws are basically not legally acceptable and enforceable in the international arena. And also there's like this question about the court case itself, but this is something else, maybe another time. But in the same time, there is other countries involved in alleged Iranian sanctions issues, such as UAE, but somehow United States is not charging anyone from UAE, not going after UAE. So I'm just trying to tell you that this is not just a threat that's specifically imposed on Turkey just because because of the natural events, or it's just specifically politically targeted people we are talking about.
Aykan, as you pointed out a moment ago, this dispute, this spat with the United States comes at something of a good time for President Erdogan, because, as you said, he can point to the United States and say, you know what, you're responsible for the economic woes that my country is going through right now. There was a spokesman for the Turkish presidency who called this, and I'm quoting here, he called it an economic coup. That's what we are seeing now. A veiled reference in some ways to the failed coup 2 years ago. But what does that mean, an economic coup?
Now, this is a continuation of Erdogan's discourse that this is economic warfare against Turkey. It fits into the overall conspiratorial mindset that none of the shortcomings or failures in the Turkish economy are Erdogan's own making, but they are carried out by these clandestine global forces, forces Erdogan sometimes refers to as the interest rate lobby. But in fact, Erdogan's own behavior proves himself wrong. The only reason why Erdogan called for snap elections earlier this year, in June 2018, was the fact that Turkey was on the brink of economic crisis. Erdogan himself is on record throughout his career calling snap elections treason, a betrayal, as a sign of underdevelopment. So why this Erdogan, who has been vehemently against snap elections, suddenly felt the need to call snap elections only 1 month to the actual economic crisis in Turkey? Clearly, he knew something was brewing in Turkey. He knew that shortly there would be a massive devaluation in Turkey. And in fact, when we take a look at the fundamentals of the Turkish economy, we see it very clearly there. Turkey's non-financial companies have amassed over $340 billion in foreign liabilities, with over $160 billion exposure to European banks alone. Turkey's inflation has hit 25% in wholesale prices, 15% in consumer prices. And at the same time, we see a fall in investor confidence, at the same time matched by not only capital flight, but also brain drain. All of these point to major structural shortcomings in the Turkish economy, and every single one of these variables have been caused by economic mismanagement. And earlier today, a British investor said that Turkey's Minister of Treasury and Finance could be a very competent person, but the optics look very bad when you have the son-in-law of the president in charge of the economy. So Turkey has both problems in fundamentals as well as in problems in its image, in its optics. And the only way out of this is through a long-term, sustained structural reform. The kind of reform Turkey engaged in following the 2001 crisis, which requires a broad-based alliance building, a broad-based participatory governance structure, right, and at the same time a commitment to an economy that's transparent, participatory, and rule-bound.
Doha, there was something else that an economist at the Council on Foreign Relations talked about, and he describes the crisis in Turkey. He said that Turkey is facing, his quote, a double whammy. It is among the most dollarized economies among emerging markets, and it's one of the most oil and gas dependent. The implication is that it makes it much harder to get out of this crisis. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that, but the question is, what do you do when you don't necessarily have the oil, let's say other countries in the Middle East have? Well, then you have to have democracy, you have to have transparency, you have to have accountability, you have to have the necessary trust by the investors so that they keep flowing this cash into your country that would be able to run this budget deficit. By the end of this year, the Turkish private sector in particular has to pay back $240 billion. How is that going to happen? Right now, you may borrow $15 billion from Qatar, but then how much of that would actually going to contribute? That's why the international investors actually are super scared of what we call a contagion across emerging markets. So many emerging markets follow this bloated growth and development model based on heavy borrowing at rather a cheap interest rate. But now what we see, especially now, that's when the President Trump comes in with his America First policy, hiking up the interest rate of the US dollar, raising the barriers in the US, would definitely jeopardize the health of the economies in emerging markets. And emerging markets, particularly in Turkey, and not only Turkey, also Brazil and South Africa, among others, need more transparency and accountability if they want to continue this bloated growth rate. But the indications that we hear from Ankara is far from really giving a assurance of such a thinking. So that should be ringing alarm bells right now.
Very quickly, Doga, what kind of help is Turkey getting from Qatar? We do know that Qatar's been buying millions of dollars worth of lira to try and prop up the currency. There were some very reassuring words that came from the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel. So Turkey is not totally isolated.
So this actually may be a silver lining, as we call it, right? I mean, Turkey may actually have the way out in Europe. And let me tell you one thing. Angela Merkel is not going to let go of Turkey easy this time. If Turkey wants a clear and more secure future, especially economically, Turkey needs to switch back to its European and Western orientation. And that doesn't only mean reforms in economy, transparency, but also undertaking a set of reforms that would bring democracy into Turkey, releasing prisoners, most of whom are journalists, and along with a much more transparent way of running the economy.
Right. Lisel, the Turkish foreign minister is optimistic that this dispute can be resolved. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Despite everything, we are ready to talk about everything to solve the existing problems as equal partners. I speak openly, but only on one condition: no threatening, no dictating.
Is that optimism well placed?
I don't necessarily know that that optimism is well placed because I think that the U.S. has decided that it needed to be more forceful because it has seen Turkey be so recalcitrant. I agree with Doga that I think Turkey might now be turning to Europe, although I want to make a little bit of a caveat here. Some people have been talking about a bit of a warming of relations or a rapprochement with Europe. It's way too early to say that, and I'm very mistrustful of Turkey's rapprochements. They're extraordinarily transactional, and they're temporary, and they're based on when Turkey is in an economic squeeze, like it was with Russia and like it was with Israel. So I'm not super optimistic that things will go forward and that Turkey's willing to talk about everything. Serdar Kılıç, the ambassador to the U.S., called National Security Advisor John Bolton on Monday. They talked, nothing really came of that. So it seems as though there's two sides that are unwilling to budge. But I want to return really quickly to something that Rob said earlier, which was that it seemed as though, why should the U.S. expect Turkey to move on the Andrew Brunson case? Because, of course, Erdogan would not intervene in the judiciary. And I find this a bit absurd, given the consolidation of the presidential system that was put in place based on a manipulated election that took place in June, based on a referendum that approved that. Erdogan has been seen to get involved with the judiciary, with the Supreme Electoral Board, with the central bank, and so forth. So he has the power.
Okay, and that's where we're going to have to end it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America, or visit us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.